Anyone who has debated feminists can tell you it can be quite frustrating due to the kinds of tactics they use. One tactic in particular is used the moment you have a feminist backed into a corner on a certain issue. They will often wiggle their way out by saying one simple phrase. Not all feminists are like that. It is such a common response that online communities have made an acronym out of it called NAFALT. The purpose of the NAFALT strategy is to keep people from judging them collectively. This is a bit hypocritical because feminists appear to have no problem judging people collectively. When the Dear White Mormons hashtag and the Dear Straight Mormons hashtag were making the rounds on Twitter, feminists were more than happy to jump on board and lecture white Mormons and straight Mormons. It also doesn't take much time on feminist blogging sites to find that feminists love to lecture males, especially white males. They are perfectly willing to judge people collectively when it fits their agenda, but insist that we judge them individually. Take, for example, this statement from MormonFeminist.org explaining the objective of Mormon feminism. It states, Mormon feminism shares the goal of equality that feminism has, but within the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and within LDS culture. Like general feminism, Mormon feminism is made up of a very diverse group of people. Mormon feminists also do not always agree on what equality means or how to get there, but they are all invested in the ongoing conversation. So they say they're all united under the banner of equality and then go on to say that they all don't agree on what equality means. I think this is a deliberate attempt to muddy their true objectives, which I have to admit is quite brilliant. Because if they were actually clear about their objectives, then people would know whether or not they should be concerned. But if you keep your objectives ambiguous, then no one can challenge you because no one can pin you down on any one doctrine. Now, before I get bombarded with feminists in my comment section pasting their copy definitions of feminism from an online dictionary, I will say that there's a big difference between the definition of feminism and the ideology of feminism. And there are a few doctrines within the ideology of feminism which characterize the core of the feminist movement making its way into the church, which I will address in my next video. But before I can get to that, I must dispel the most common feminist myths that I believe are the most pressing in regards to the Mormon community. The first myth I would like to address is the gender wage gap, because this is one that is being pushed very hard, especially in Utah, where they're saying the gender wage gap is one of the worst in the nation and often point to Mormon culture as a primary causal factor. I have to say it's quite disappointing to see church-owned news like Deseret News and KSL pushing this myth, but they have probably been subverted by SJWs like most institutions with influence to shape opinions. The gender wage gap is calculated by taking all the earnings of men and all the earnings of women and averaging them out, which results in women making 77 cents to every dollar a man makes. But this doesn't take into account any of the factors that determine pay. For example, it is a fact that men work more dangerous jobs, which is why they make up 93% of workplace deaths. On average, they work longer hours and are more likely to work on weekends. They, on average, have more experience because they don't take time off to have and raise children. While there are many factors that contribute to men making more money, one very important reason is that men on average choose degrees in fields that pay more money, like the STEM fields, which is an acronym for science, technology, engineering, and math. And these are fields that pay higher wages. So when you control for all factors that determine pay, the gender wage gap nearly disappears. The truth is that it's women's own choices that account for the general disparity in earnings between the sexes. This is the point in the argument that feminists will claim that the reason women make career choices that result in lower pay has to do with the culture. You even have Mormon feminists throwing around the term aspirational shame, as if Mormon women are shamed out of having aspirations outside of the home. Do they not realize that the LDS Church is one of the few remaining institutions that actually supports and encourages stay-at-home motherhood? Do they not realize that we are a part of a much broader culture which actively discourages motherhood, especially stay-at-home motherhood? It is also so ingrained into the broader culture that women staying home with their kids are rebels against the norm. Now I know that when they talk about aspirational shame, they are referring to women who aspire for things outside the home, but just take a minute and think about how that sounds to a stay-at-home mother. Do women who stay home with their children lack aspiration? Is stay-at-home motherhood an unworthy thing to aspire to? I think that's something worth pondering. So the typical feminist argument is that women choose lower-paying fields and make career choices that lower pay because of Mormon cultural expectations and the way our society is structured. While we do sustain and encourage traditional gender roles and prioritizing family, There are a few other reasons that factor into women's career choices. For example, studies have been done in Scandinavian countries, which I will leave a link to in the description, and what they found was that the countries that have the most equality in terms of opportunity are where the largest percentage of men and women choose traditionally gendered professions. So in Norway, for instance, almost all the nurses were women and almost all the engineers were men, and this was in 2011. The reason is because once you eradicate environmental barriers and the opportunity landscape is flattened, men and women on the whole choose professions that match their temperaments and innate predispositions. One California state psychology professor, Richard Lippa, said, and I quote, "Men are much more interested in thing-oriented occupations, things like being an engineer or a mechanic. Women, relatively, are much more interested in people-oriented occupations." Now, this professor conducted a study in 53 nations and found that the sex-specific preference for jobs was universal. So the more free countries become, the greater the gender differences become, because men and women are free to pursue the things they are innately interested in. So we can push as much propaganda as we want to try and shuffle women into STEM fields, but the reality is that women's interests aren't as high for STEM fields when compared to men. Of course, there are exceptions to the rule, but exceptions don't prove the rule is false. As far as aspirational differences are concerned, there was an article written recently by Susan Pinker, which I will leave a link to as well. She addresses in the article and points to studies that show that men and women have different priorities and different measures for what they count for success. It was found that overall, men as a group valued full-time work, making an impact, and earning a high income, whereas women as a group more often valued part-time work, along with time for close relationships, family, and community involvement. So in other words, women are more likely to place a higher value on other life priorities outside of making a lot of money. While both male and female models for success are valuable for the health and stability of a civilization, the problem, as this article points out, is that we're using a male-centric model when measuring success. The reason why this is so important to understand is because differences in outcome between the sexes aren't just about Mormon culture. Women, Mormon and non-Mormon alike, find happiness and fulfillment in ways that diverge from the male norm. It isn't about aspirational shame, but rather aspirational differences. Now, I want to make it clear that I'm not saying discrimination doesn't exist. It certainly exists, and where it does exist, it should be dealt with and eliminated. But dealing with individual biases isn't going to change these demographic trends. No amount of patriarchy smashing and doing away with gender roles is going to change these demographic trends either, because these differences in outcome have more to do with temperamental and aspirational differences between the sexes. While I'm still on the subject of gender differences, I also need to address modesty. Lately, feminists have been attacking our modesty standards because women are held to a higher standard when it comes to covering their bodies. Feminists will say that this is the result of women being objectified. Now, I know Mormons will say that men are held to modesty standards too, which is true. However, modesty is a bigger burden for women, and again, it comes down to gender differences. Here's one of the best explanations I have heard on why modesty standards are higher for women. This was written by a Twitter friend of mine, CM Hammer, who I will leave a link to if you want to follow him on Twitter. He stated, "The male-female relationship is about the creation and maintenance of the next generation and, religiously speaking, the formation of eternal families. Men and women have inherently different roles in this relationship, and we are both, quote, objectified based on these roles. Women offer their bodies as a miraculous home of new life from conception to birth and a source of nourishment for the first couple of years of life. On the whole, a woman's disposition and character are oriented toward nurturing and care. Men are objectified for status, wealth, and strength to provide and protect this progeny. Women's fashion has always been oriented toward displays that emphasize their procreative health and vitality. Women displaying their bodies and men displaying their wealth and status markers naturally flow from these roles." He follows up with this statement, "Feminism is hostile to the entire notion that men and women are inherently different. It seeks to repudiate and pathologize roles of men and women. It only breeds resentment and anger at what naturally is for what can never be. I think this is the problem that lies at the heart of much of leftist dogma, which is a denial and/or resentment toward human nature." Now, feminists are going to accuse me of something called internalized misogyny. I thought I would take some time to explain what this means, because it shows just how contemptible they view women who disagree with them. Internalized misogyny describes women who have internalized their own sexism to such a degree that they are incapable of thinking for themselves and making decisions in their best interest. This was the explanation Kate Kelly used when explaining to the media why Mormon women weren't going to vote for Hillary. She stated, quote, "I think that it's internalized misogyny that will ultimately lead Mormon women to vote against their best interests." I'll leave a link to the article in the description, but the concept of internalized misogyny is so incredibly insulting, demeaning, and quite frankly, it's sexist. I think feminists who entertain this concept should be ashamed. Now, they have every right to judge women like me this way. I just find it ironic that these very same feminists will lecture us Mormons not to judge them for having different opinions, and yet they judge women this way who don't share their opinions. Now, I would like to wrap up this video with a message for the Mormon feminists. You may have the media, academia, and many other institutions on your side, but that does not make you right, nor does it endow you with the mantle of being our moral and intellectual superiors. Just because you have taken initiative on certain issues does not give you a monopoly of opinion over them. We have opinions too, and just because we might disagree doesn't give you moral permission to treat us like we are backwards and uneducated. We are tired of the finger-wagging, the shaming, the smug and sanctimonious lectures and blog posts. We see you on your high horse, but here's the thing, we don't answer to you. It is not your moral duty to put us in our place when we have broken a commandment in the book of political correctness. Political correctness might be your religion, but it isn't ours. Mormons might be extremely patient, perhaps more patient than most, but our patience has its limits. And that is the note I will end this video on. Thanks for watching.